It's just the Tao. What you're doing is you're walking the way. So you accord with that nature, you harmonize with it, you tune into that nature. You'll see where I'm going to go with this. And then, if you are able to cultivate this path and do it well, regulate is another translation of it, but just means to live this life of the way. This is called what? Meaning? Interesting, the one on the left is filial. Huh? Teaching, instruction. This is what it means to study. To study is to learn how to live. Okay? So we're going back to another philosopher like Hadot, who talks about philosophy as not something you study, but a way you learn to live. He's a Western thinker. So if we look at this, we see a correspondence. So where I'm going now is what this awakening is assuming is that we have a natural orientation, we have a natural disposition, that when it's working right, it works for us and leads to awakening, leads to a really good life. Now, good life in the capital G, like the ancients meant good in the sense that it's wholesome, it's healthy, it's meaningful, it has purpose. It's not fraught with anxiety and tension and disappointments and regrets and so forth. And it's good for yourself, and it's good for others, and it's good for the world. This is what goodness means. That assumption is there, but the opposite is also true. In other words, if we are not working with that nature, according with that nature, nurturing the nature is the expression that they use, then we won't get it. We won't realize it. This makes sense? So what the ground of awakening, what the Bodhimanda is, Bodhimanda means literally place of awakening or arena of awakening, is our own mind and body. This is the monastery. This is the ground. It's not outside. So you nurture this. You work on this. And how do you work on this? You work on it on many levels. But I'm gonna bring out 3 tonight. I'm going to talk about it from a psychological point of view, talk from a social point of view, and talk about it from a natural point of view. This is not mystical when we're getting at this level. What we're talking about is what is it within those 3 realms that nurture this, that make it come. So at the end of that Cow Mountain passage, the line goes, if you nurture it, if you attend to it, it thrives, it flourishes. If you neglect it, it wastes away. So those are the first 2 lines. In other words, if you take care of this, and this is talking about the mind, the body, the emotions, the thoughts, the feelings, if you nurture it, it thrives and totally connects with the way. If you don't, it pines away, it wastes away. And then it says, as for its comings and goings, this is a very interesting line, it has no time or place, and no one knows where it abides. Now what this is describing is what I call plasticity. Okay, so you all familiar with the term plasticity, right? Because we've used it a number of times. And it's usually associated with neuroplasticity, right? So anybody not clear what neuroplasticity is? Doesn't mean your brain is plastic. Plastic means able to change, like clay can be molded. So plastic means it can be adapted, it can change. It's never just fixed or constant. It's constantly changing by what we eat, by injuries to it or healthy neurons and so on and so forth. If somebody has a stroke, they can recover from a stroke with certain therapies and so forth. So plasticity means it is adaptable. If you lose eyesight, the brain can adapt by increasing hearing or sensibility. So there's this flexibility. That's what plasticity means. What they're discovering, so what I'm suggesting with this quote from the Confucian text is, it doesn't have a place it abides, and it doesn't have a coming and going. It's not located in any one place, but it's close to what Buddhists describe as consciousness of the mind, which is this interactive field of your sense organs and the objects of those senses and the consciousness that links them. Remember the passage we worked last week out of the 6th Patriarch Sutra. So plasticity is actually a new term describing a phenomenon that these sages were aware of, that there is no autonomous, closed-off individual called me, but there is an interactive phenomena with the mind and consciousness through the social, through the natural, and coming and going. No one knows where that is. No one knows where it abides because it's everywhere. We are, in fact, intrinsically interactive at all times with our natural environment, with our social environment, and with the workings of our consciousness, both inner and outer. These are also kind of words we use. There is no inner and outer. You understand? Sort of this. Now this goes to where I want to go a little bit tonight. So if we understand it that way, then all three of those, your social relational world, your natural world, and your inner psychological world, could be portals for awakening. And in fact, they are the portals for awakening. If these things are centered and right, you will thrive. And if not, the opposite happens. We get disjointed, disconnected, out of sorts. Anomy. Anomy? Anomy is a sociological term from the French. It means basically without norm. A nome, meaning without compass, without guide. We're floating, we're drifting, therefore, sort of lost. And the next stage of it is called alienation. So you go from anomy to alienation, where you feel this disjunction. You feel this disconnect from all three worlds, from yourself. You don't feel at home in your own mind and body. You don't feel socially at home and connected. And at a deeper level, even in the natural world, you feel distant, apart, separated. So this anomy comes when this is not attuned. The opposite that happens when it is attuned comes awakening, interconnectedness. So this is really getting at where I wanted to go, because I wanted to look at these particularly and ask you to sort of think maybe through the summer to do a sort of checklist of where these set up for you, where the psychological, the social, and the natural, what's going on there. Is it something that is attuned? Is it something that's in accord? Is it something that's nurturing? I mean, in a sense, are you eating well? Are you eating well in terms of these three realms or not? Because this will make all the difference as to whether this process can work itself out. Let me just say, start with one concept. So plasticity has been assumed to be neural, but now they're finding out what? That it's not just neural, it's also social. So plasticity is happening, and it's also happening at the genetic level. So what we assume to be sort of fixed kind of spaces of interaction that were more or less impervious now turned out to be highly dynamic. The example I'll give you is something called, who's a scientist here? Because I have to be careful I go, or who's been trained as a scientist. Okay, good. So catch me if I'm wrong here, or not. Be kind and forgive me. But there's something called the vagus nerve. And the vagus nerve is a nerve that runs from the brain to the heart, right? And this vagus nerve, V-A-G-U-S, is a very important nerve because it's the one that regulates the heart and the heartbeat, okay? And it's part of what's called the autonomic system or the parasympathetic system, which means it runs by itself. It's something that's sort of just going by itself, and it's not really thought to be controlled by consciousness or will or anything like this. It's an automatic function thing. But now the latest experiments in the last year with people researching this found out that it too has plasticity to it. Really interesting. In other words, when vagal tone is the word they use, when you have vagal tone, it means you have boom, you have harmony. And when you have vagal tone, your cardiovascular system is attuned, and your immune system works properly, and even your absorption of glucose, which is one of the causes of diabetes, is all balanced when this vagal tone is good. And the higher the vagal tone, the higher your state of health. Now they found that vagal tone can go up or down based on things happening in the external environment. This is new. And this is part of a new field called social genomics, genomics. In other words, the study of both the parasympathetic system and the genetic system as not autonomous fixed things, but interacting. Now, what do you think is the largest interactive or plasticity element in the vagal tone? What causes it? Diet? Perhaps? Anybody? Stress, breathing. This is why they're interested in this in meditation. Because in fact, they did meditation studies where they just did simple meditation exercises and the vagal tone changed and went up and got better and became more in tune. And then the control group who didn't meditate, who knows what they did, maybe watch TV or something, their vagal tone stayed the same or was in a state of deterioration. But within this, they found something else. This is going to be quite surprising. It was social. It was social. If in fact you have social contact, particularly eyes and face and voice, in conversation directly, your vagal tone increases. And the converse is true. If you pull away from human intersubjective interactions, your vagal tone gets unhealthier and healthier and healthier. Hence, your cardiovascular system becomes, and your immune system becomes threatened. So these studies of the increase of the cardiovascular and immune system problems we have, and of course, the glucose, what's happening? Well, if you start to look at it, I am now going anecdotal here. This is not a controlled experiment, but I say the lack of face-to-face contact between people is increasing at all levels. And as it increases, these issues are also becoming more problematic. The amount of time that people spend in front of screens of one form or another has gone up exponentially in the last this last generation even, and so have these things. And they actually are now doing the studies to show that in fact, you can reverse that vagal tone deterioration by having human interaction, not Skype. It's got to be visceral, it's got to be in, because there's something going on in those interactions. Now they know this. The reason I get interested in this, because I'm really interested in children and working with children. And they know that this is the key for the neural, social, emotional development of children is called intersubjectivity. In other words, there's a certain stage when they get in their growth in the first year where the facial interaction between the parent or the primary person and the child becomes very direct. Eye contact is made, and there's an interaction going on. They've actually then mapped this with MRI to show that certain parts of the brain are then kicking into gear, developing. And as they develop, these become later the indicators for both emotional, psychological success, but also for cognitive success in schools and so forth. And it's human interaction. It's this thing. It's called intersubjectivity. So this becomes a really interesting factor if you say, okay, so looking at this, am I nurturing my social? Okay, let's just assume that vagal tone is a good thing for meditators. It's a good thing to have this because it increases your nature. It nurtures your nature. So therefore, this would be a good portal. So what I'm saying is look at this and ask, how much time am I spending in human interaction? And how much time am I not? You're going to find this shocking. 90% of the time that children spend in their lives indoors is 90%. Children spend 90% of their time indoors and only 10% outdoors. And the amount of time they spend in human action compared to interaction here is 70%. And it's increasing day by day. They now have camps for children to literally break their addiction at 8 and 9 years old to these devices. And when you see the documentaries on children trying to do this, you see the same symptoms of someone trying to break an alcohol, heroin addiction. They're shaking. They have sweats and they have tremors. And they talk about how they want to do it, and they only last an hour before they have to pick it up again. Okay? So what I'm suggesting here is we have here the nature. If the nature's working right, we get awakened. But if we don't cultivate this correctly, now, of course, the Buddha didn't talk about this because those were not the things that were there at his time. He talked about other things. So when the monks take their vows now, they say, well, in order to cultivate and nurture this light, we're going to stay away from dancing and entertainment. Yeah, right. Okay, you're not going to the dance. When's the last time you went to a dance? when's the last time you went to a burlesque show? Well, no, you don't. It's in the tube. So the equivalent, the Buddha was talking about where the outflows were occurring, 2,000 years ago. We have to adjust this and say, where are they occurring now? These devices are literally sucking out your essence and energy. And, it's like, oh, the texts say this. My teacher said this. I thought, what is he talking about? TV is a good thing. He says, no, it's not. You were watching, but it's sucking your energy out. What's he and now I understand. Turn it off for a while, and you'll see this. So this is the first level, just to talk about just one aspect of this, if, in fact, that's social. So what I'm suggesting is it might mean you spend more time with people. Whoa. But not everybody. Choose your friends wisely. Again, I go back to Mencius. Draw near the coal, you turn black. Yeah, we're having a hangout party. I actually saw the New York Times. They were having a gathering. Everybody in the room was looking down at the cocktail hour doing this. And they were called connecting. This is not connecting. This is actually disconnecting. So think about how much time you spend there. Think about ways to constructively spend. Have tea. Regularly now, I include 2 94-year-olds in my social circle. I meet with them every other week. They both live in Berkeley, retired professors. One's Houston Smith, and the other one's Herb Fingerett. And that's their world. They don't have devices. Well, Houston does. He has a cochlear implant that allows him to hear. But it's not something he watches. It's because he wants to have interaction. The last time we had lunch with him, he was so happy with the social interaction, he didn't touch a bite of his food. What are you doing? What are you doing? How's that project going? That's wonderful. How's your mother? Bang, bang, bang. 94 years old. And I went to a restaurant later, and I saw the same possibility happen, and the kids were there. Nobody was talking to each other. Everybody was, working with a device. So this would be one area you can look at, okay? Let's go to the natural. Again, if we're right in this regard, then the natural becomes a way to nurture. So the more time you spend in nature directly, whereas I'm saying 90% of children's time is spent inside, the 10% outside is usually only going from one place to another. So their contact with nature is the Discovery Channel. It's the cartoons on Saturday morning where there might be something on. But it's through the tube, too, that they learn about nature. So this, in turn, has an effect of decreasing our nature. Our nature is actually enhanced by contact with nature. So if you see the ancient monasteries, when we were traveling in China, when you go to the ancient monasteries, you see most of the famous ones are in the mountains. They're the equivalent of the national parks. Why did they locate there? Oh, I don't want to pay taxes. No, they didn't locate. They located there because be close to nature is to be close to your nature. There's a sync. Emerson understood this. We have poets in our tradition that understood this really well. The gateway to your nature is through nature. And the loss of nature, the loss of that is the loss of our nature. So again, then what you want to do is increase that time to go out. So for me, this summer, I'm going to go to Maine, okay? And not on the Discovery Channel or not on a website. I'm actually going to go to Maine, and I'll spend 2 to 3 weeks totally disconnected. And even I can feel that little shift when, because we do have plugs. They put them in, but they're dead. So they only get plugged on if there's an emergency. They turn on a generator because you need an emergency generator for something. But most of the time, there's not. So you plug it in, and you just sit there, and nothing's happening. And that nothing happening is good. You see, this is the problem because you say, well, I don't want to be in nature. I get bored. And every time the kids come up for the summer, every summer they get more and more bored faster and faster. And they bring all their little devices. It used to be they bring up their scouting knives and, all these things, and now more and more they're bringing their devices. So all the ride up in the back or looking at the screen in the car now, nothing beside, they're on the way. They ride up, there's moose, there's deer, there's elk, there's all these kind of things, and they're just beep, 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 beep. And then they get up at the camp, and there's this incredible lake that's so pure we can still drink out of it directly. And you hear the loons at night, and they're beep, 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 until the batteries die. Then they go over, and they plug it in. And then you have karmic collapse, because nothing works. And they go through a sort of withdrawal until they start to figure out, well, now what are we going to do? Well, there's things outside. There's canoes, there's kayaks, we go swimming, we can go look for Indian, artifacts and things like that. And finally, after a couple weeks, they start to recover, slowly recover. And every year it gets harder and harder because the parents think they're giving them a head start by getting them these devices earlier and earlier and earlier. So let me tell you a couple stories. One story goes back to the 1940s. Where we are, we're on a point. Everybody know what a point is? It's like, well, if you haven't been in nature, you wouldn't know what a point is. It's like a piece of land that goes out into the lake, and so there's lake around 3/4 of it. So we're on a point, and our house is on the point. And across the point, there's an island, and it's close enough that you can swim to it. So usually we visit by swimming. And the old people take canoes to come over. But there's a family that lives on that island. They've been there for generations. And we swim over and, meet and talk and so forth. So I went over and met the old timer there. His name's John. And we were talking about this. And he said, no, we banned the devices here. The kids just have to figure out what to do with themselves. We lock them up when they get here, and we don't unlock them till they go. And he said, oh, that was that screaming I heard the other day. He said, that was it. But they recover. He said, let me tell you about my brother. He said, my brother was a World War II vet who then was forced into the Bataan Death March. Some of you know this historical Bataan Death March? Bataan has been a peninsula going, where is it going now? I'm thinking through, is it into Malaysia, coming through Burma? The Philippines. Okay. So what the Japanese did to prisoners of war, they put them on a death march where they were marched all day long in the hot sun with no food or water, and the idea was to maybe kill them all. And yet some survived this horrible death march, and then when they survived, they were put to work. And as soon as they couldn't work, they were just killed on the spot. Very few survived. I think it was like 10% survived the Bataan Death March. 90% died. He was one of the survivors. But when he came back, he was completely a basket case. John was telling me a story. He said they put him in the VA hospitals, they put him in psychiatric hospitals, nothing worked. He was completely, now we call it post-traumatic stress. But he was shot. And so John said, well, I went to his last hospital, I checked him out against medical advice, put him in the station wagon, brought him up here. And we boated across. There's no boat to the island, so they boat across. I brought enough food and supplies, made sure he had it, and I left him there for 2 years. Well, no, he visited. He didn't leave him alone, but he left him there so that he had no telephone, no access to medicine or doctors, just there on the island with nature, with food, with his brother as a companion, and so forth. Within 2 years, he recovered, completely fine. I met him later, and I would have never guessed that this was someone who had gone through. Nature healed him. Nature healed him. So again, our relationship to nature, if you think, well, what am I going to do this summer? Think about increasing tea with somebody. Tea. Everybody know tea or coffee? And sitting down, but also increase your contact with nature. Pull out of the artificial and get into the real more. However you do that. Now, I know there's a group going up to Oregon for the summer retreat. That's one of those things. And people up there experience a revitalization of something they don't get in the city because they're close to nature. Okay. The other thing that happens with a psychological, if you don't spend enough time in nature, you don't spend enough time with people, the sense of self goes two directions. It either gets too small and shriveled up and depressed and lonely, and then feeling inferior, and then feeling depressed, and so on and so forth, or it gets overinflated too big and thinks, I am the center of everything. So this phenomenon, if you're spending time online most of the time, not social, not in nature, you start to feel much bigger than you really are. When you actually get in nature, you start to shrink down to your normal size. So one of the simple exercises I would say is These are, now I'm getting editorializing a bit. Look up. Look up every day this summer, both during the daytime. There's a Taoist exercise, by the way, that you do this way. With your hands, you frame it like this. You stand, it's a meditation. You frame a patch of blue, and you let your mind and your consciousness go into that patch of blue for 5, 10, 15 minutes. And then you slowly come down. I could teach you that if you're interested in that, but that's one of the Taoist meditations. But then do it at night too. Look at the stars, look at the moon, look at that and say, oh, okay, change my perspective. And then the opposite, look down. Look really down. Look down into the grass. Figure out what's going on there. I took some pictures today because I looked down on my grass, and there's this incredible, in the fennel in my yard, are these caterpillars now. And they are the most incredible looking caterpillars. Their colors are like, wow, like Matisse. And so I was taking pictures of them, watching them, and I realized soon they're going to be butterflies. That's a good thing to do, you know. I mean, I wasn't writing. I was doing that. But it balanced something. So look up, look down. This will help restore the psychological balance. And then look within. Do some meditation. If you do this, if you can include this in your summer, you'll be nurturing that nature from the social to the natural to the psychological. Really important. And I say this because right now, the possibilities of it outflowing are growing day by day. The thing I just saw this week, a new pair of glasses. Not these glasses. A new pair of glasses that I can have these glasses, I can go like this. And I can have my cell phone connection through my glasses. I can be online with a screen in my glasses, right? And I can shop with these. And you can even have in sun-tinted forms. This is a new Google thing. Sorry if you're Google stock. But you put these glasses on and you can completely walk around the world, not in the world at all. Because on that little screen projected will be a full-size, what seems to your eye, a full-size screen that allows you to search and Google and do the web, allows you to do and watch a movie. You can do anything you can download on your computer now will be in glasses. Okay, so I'm just saying the Buddha would find this really interesting. Really interesting. You know, it's like you call this progress, but what you've done now is you've fragmented your consciousness. You've collapsed your consciousness into these subtle, magnificent outflows. You've turned one outflow into a 10,000 by doing this. And the more, the problem is the more this happens, the more it becomes habituated and you can't reverse it. This becomes addictive. So if you're thinking of buying the glasses, don't. Don't get them. Because while you're there, imagine your kids getting them. Everybody's at dinner. Yeah, and they're talking because they're talking on the cell phone, or they're watching a movie, and you're not there anymore. Okay? So think before you get these things. Really, do you want to go in that direction? Because what it's doing. One story I will. All of humans' misery and sufferings comes from one thing. I'm quoting someone. The exact quote is, not being able to sit in a quiet room alone. All of human suffering's misery come from one thing, not being able to sit in a quiet room alone, what we now call boredom. But it was sitting in a quiet space alone that the Buddha got awakened. So what do we do with this? Look at this. This is Pascal. Pascal's quote. Human suffering comes from the inability to sit in a quiet room alone. So this urge to do this is where we begin the investigation of the psychological. When I said the 3 non-outflow studies, the first one is precepting. At the gross level, it means you stop from doing bad things. Killing, stealing, sexual misconduct, lying, intoxicants. That's the coarse level. The next level of precepting, you precept your organs, your sensory organs, and don't let them go out and harm you. At a deeper level, you precept your own mind. And so it's not so much even content of what you're looking at. It's the intent at which you're looking. That's the outflow. You could say, well, I watch good things, unlike some people who watch really bad things. But you're very watching of it, and the intent behind it, which is to escape that boredom or escape that sitting alone with yourself, is actually where the outflow happens, regardless of what you're watching. This becomes really subtle. This is where you're getting into consciousness nurturing from Buddhism. So it can be wholesome, but it's still the intent to get away from one's own being that then becomes the outflow. So the last story I'll tell, because I was thinking of children again, and I was thinking of plasticity. And so some years ago, one of my jobs I took on when I dropped out of graduate school, and I didn't drop out because I was failing. I actually dropped out because I was doing too well. And as I started to do well, I got invited to faculty cocktail parties. Yeah, and so after the first faculty cocktail party, I decided time to drop out. I saw the future and I didn't want to go there. That's another story. So one of the things I took up, one of the returns for me was being in graduate school, being so much in my head, I lost touch with my nature and the natural world. And so I went back and started to backpack, solo backpack into the wilderness, and I started to work with children. And both of those became portals for me, getting back in touch with something that was real. And so in working with children, I had a job where we had a residential treatment center in the Central Valley in Modesto. And the concept was we would take very severely disturbed children who were normally hospitalized, institutionalized, and on heavy medications and so forth, and bring them into a residential setting, a home. So we bought a couple homes, you know, bedrooms, kitchen, the whole thing in a yard, settled those right in the middle class neighborhoods. Had a lot of talks with the neighbors because they weren't too cool about this idea that we were bringing in these disturbed kids. But we worked it, and so we set up a home and worked on them therapeutically in a home setting as opposed to an institutional setting. Now, one of the kids, we get all kinds of kids. We get kids who are in gangs, we get kids who had burned down homes or shopping centers, who had stolen, who were torturing animals, who would attack people, but didn't kill them yet, but were on that path. And we would get girls who had been sexually, physically abused, and so forth. And we had a range from 3-year-old up to 13. And at every one time we had 6 kids in the home. And so we had a full-time staff, and then we set up a couple who would serve as parents. So you and I would work together as a couple for 1 week, doing what parents did. Take them to the county fair, take them to school, get them registered, deal with everything like that, but have a setting that was normal that they were adjusting to. So anyways, one kid in particular, I was just going to tell you the story tonight, and some of them I won't tell you because they're just really too sad, but this thing that just happened in Cleveland this last week, if you followed it, we got girls that were in that situation. This was back in the 70s. So I'm just telling you, you get a 9 or 10-year-old girl who's been through something like that. They had their hands full. But this was a little boy. His name was Stevie. We got him. He was turning 4. Okay. Now that's a wonderful, anybody who's worked with kids, it's past the horrible 2s. It's into the 4s. It's pretty cool. Kids at 4 are really full of wonder, full of curiosity, and they're just a joy to be with. Not Stevie, because at 2, his parents abandoned him. And he lived then from 2 to 3 in a cardboard box in a field with his 8-year-old sister, the only caretaker. So she would go out and scavenge food and bring it back, try to take care of him. He was basically a savage. He was totally, and we got Stevie. Beautiful kid, but a real mess. And Stevie, when he came in, would just go into tantrums all the time. He could not be alone with himself when we came in for more than 6 seconds. We would do what we call baseline. So you'd say, here's some blocks and toys, play. 1001, 1002, well, couldn't play. He would be on to the adult, grabbing, getting attention any way he could, usually negative. And this went on. And at nighttime, it was horrible to put him into bed because he would just scream, you know, the separation, fears, and so forth. He did nothing a normal kid would do. He was constantly just picking at people, irritating people, clinging to people. No toys, nothing caught his attention. And when they brought him, they said this may be not possible to bring him back, given what he'd been through. So we were kind of loose in those days. This was back in the 70s, so I looked a little different in our lifestyle, but I won't go into that. So, but one of the things we were doing was spending more time in nature. There was a back to nature movement that was, so we decided we would take the kids for 2 weeks every summer backpacking into the Sierras. Now, some of these kids were coming out of the inner cities, had never been even in their backyard, much less into the wilderness. So that was a trip, and we debated, and we thought, well, we'll take Stevie. So there we go into the wilderness backpacking up into the high Sierras with Stevie, and it was the same, day after day after day. Go swimming, he would go in and scream and come back out and blah, 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 and this went on and on and on. But we just sort of let all their devices, they had little transistor radios and stuff, okay, but they didn't have iPhones or anything like that. All the batteries went dead, and the kids started to get more and more nature. And even that little girl started to come back, started to smile again, and so forth. But Stevie, not. And all the kids were sort of rooting for him because they wanted him to come. And we just let nature do it. We'd look at the stars at night, we'd sing songs around the campfire, and it didn't seem that Stevie was absorbing any of this. And then as we were coming out of the wilderness, the kids were literally transformed. I can't tell you. We stopped their medications, and they had no withdrawal symptoms. They were on some pretty heavy-duty stuff. And they completely just came back, being in nature, without all that distraction and without all that tension that was normally in their lives. And you could see it in their faces. It was wonderful, except for Stevie. So we're hiking out, and all of a sudden we hear, "Look, a butterfly, a butterfly." And I'm going, "Who is that?" It's Stevie. In the back, finally, on the last day we're hiking out, his attention moved and he saw a butterfly. And it was like this source of wonder for him. Wow, look at that. And everybody was like almost crying because it was the turning point. He had actually made a turn to come back into the natural and therefore come into what it meant to be a 4-year-old, which is what 4-year-olds should be doing. And then step by step, each time more and more happened. So what I'm suggesting to you, one, is the power of nature and the power of our environment, if we use it well, to nurture us. But also, even at the point where it seems to be almost hopeless and gone, it can be recovered. This passage goes on. I didn't use the passage tonight. It goes on and says, this Tao never leaves us for an instant. If it could leave it, it wouldn't be called this Tao. So this nature doesn't leave either. So if that can happen, then there's all sorts of possibilities. So I'm going to stop there tonight. I was going to do most of the text, and I decided I would spend some time working on these ideas to sort of maybe both inspire myself, but inspire you to think about what you're going to do this summer and how you're going to spend your time in a social, natural, and psychological way. Please keep up your meditation as a daily practice, but rethink those other two dimensions, and as much as you can, find ways to cultivate that, because if it's right, if the plasticity thing is right, what they found was in the vagal studies, the vagal tone, by having those interactions, face-to-face direct, that the vagal tone went up. But also, when the vagal tone went up, it actually increased and nurtured the relationships. So it was a loop that was happening. Not only was it coming in and having a plastic effect, but it was going out and having a plastic effect on the environment, in the relationships of the family, and so forth. So this ancient text I was talking about, its comings and goings, it doesn't have any place in abide. We're looking at plasticity now sort of one-dimensionally. But the social genomics studies are showing that it's actually interactive. Not only does it in turn nurture you, but you in turn change the vibe, you change a pattern, and it affects both your family and the natural world. This is really very interesting stuff. So play around with it this summer. Play around with the plastic and see if you can, not that plastic, and not that plastic. Yes?
Did the studies mention anything about contact with animals?
The newest studies are very interesting with that. I'm glad you brought that up. should go to Harry Harlow, but I won't. Harry Harlow was my psychology professor when I was an undergraduate, and he was the one that tortured the rhesus monkeys to show that mothers mattered. I won't go into that. I mean, it's like, duh, of course mothers matter. No, they're milk machines. Now, at that time, psychology was they're milk machines. That's all they do is provide milk. And he put his kid in what was called the Skinner box to show that all they needed was basic food and sleep, and they didn't need any touching or connection. So to show this, that they did, he put needles into phony monkeys that were looked like monkeys, and they were terry cloth, but there were needles, so when the baby monkey went to grab mummy, he got the needle poked in and then moved away. And he was actually trying to show that mothers matter. And this is how he had to do it at that time, to show that they're more important than just milk. But of course, those monkeys went completely... Anyhow, that's another story. So the recent stuff now going on is especially with premature babies. So premature babies, first of all, respond. They have them in the premature labs, and they have all these devices to make them well, which basically has to do with sucking, the ability to suck, because they won't nurture if they're premature and they suck. Oxygenation, their oxygenation levels are low. I forget what the third one is. There's a third one. And they had all these devices do it, and then somebody noticed that when this woman from therapy came in and played a guitar, that the indices of the oxygenation and sucking in the other one went up. So then they went the next step and said, what if we play the guitar and the mother holds the baby? And it went up even higher. And then when the mother held the baby and sang, they reached levels that they would see with normal healthy kids, and all their devices couldn't do it. So they're going, wow, what's going on here? They also noticed that heart rate for children and even for adults goes from one thing to a normal drop in 5 seconds after being picked up. So if you pick up a baby, and you're talking about this connection, right? Boom, 5 seconds, the heartbeat goes down. So again, what you're talking about is, what was your question then? Okay, so the same thing is happening with animals. The same thing is happening with animals. So again, a boy who was severely, like maybe one of the kids in the Boston Marathon, lost a hand, lost a leg, severely handicapped, and had brain damage as well, and they couldn't reach him. They brought a dog into the hospital, and the dog went up on his bed and started just licking his hand. The first time, the kid's eyes opened, and a slight smile comes to his face. They thought he was brain dead. And this is coming, and then they watched the monitors, what was happening with his heartbeat, and everything was like, so the dog. And so this is pretty incredible. The next program they're doing, and they're finding the most success rate with, in terms of this, because now we're talking about the very subtle workings of consciousness and the parasympathetic system and all that, is in prisons. So they're taking hardened criminals in prisons, men usually, that have no chance of getting out because they're really gone over the deep end, and they bring in pets. They bring in cats and dogs that have been neglected, or they're strays or whatnot, and they teach them how to groom and to learn veterinary skills and then restore them, and then they go out and they find homes for them. And they thought, well, this is a good thing to do for the animals, because just having to make license plates or, push weights is really stupid. But what they found was, more than any other factor in terms of getting them into the possibility of parole, was having the pet. And they started to do studies both on these things, on the physiological, but on the psychological. And you'd see, it's like Lenny out of Mice and Men. You'd see this Hulk with this little kitten. And all of a sudden, this compassionate, kind energy would start coming out of this, an unconditional, because the kitten couldn't hurt him. The kitten was dependent on him. And suddenly, this started to rise. The recidivism rate for those prisoners compared to the normal is 3 times higher. They don't, in other words, 3 times lower. They don't go back into prison. Those that have had these pets. This is really interesting stuff. Okay? Now, this is not to encourage you to get a pet, per se, or that's a fix-all, but it's just saying we're talking about nurturing the nature at all levels, and there's many ways to think about doing this. Okay? Not just sitting in meditation, but the whole of your life. Think about what nurtures this, and then increase that. How's that? Okay, we went a little over it, I'm sorry, but I hope you all have a really good summer, that you nurture yourselves really well. Share your stories, come back in the fall. We'll start up again with Han Shan. Any announcements? Anything to